to welcome everyone to the first in a new seminar series hosted by the Centre for Cultures and Environments of Health here at the University of Exeter and organised by the Shame and Medicine Project. Shame and Medicine in Literature. Shame, Elspeth Probyn tells us, is a painful thing to write about. This seminar series interrogates the connections between the experience of shame and its literary representation, in part extending discussions that will emerge in a future special issue of Literature and Medicine entitled Shame and Medicine. And it's going to be co-organized by Dr. Katharine Cheston and myself. And for the first seminar, we're lucky to have Dr. Cheston speak to us on shame, invisibility, and ill feelings. Katharine Cheston is an honorary fellow and soon to be postdoctoral research fellow at the Institute for Medical Humanities, Durham University. She has been a visiting scholar of the Shame and Medicine Project since September. Her PhD, which she finished in April 2024, was an interdisciplinary exploration of women's experiences of illnesses that are described in the clinical literature as medically unexplained. She focused particularly on how women who live with these illnesses experience shame and stigma, and indeed how they have been shamed and stigmatized. Thank you very much, Dr.
Thanks so much, Arthur, for the introduction, and thanks for having me. I'm just going to share my screen. Can you see that? All right. Yeah, it looks like it is. Great. So I'm going to speak about shame, invisibility, and ill feelings. And the presentation is based on the paper that's part of the special issue that Arthur mentioned, but it's also, and particularly the latter part of the presentation, is sort of reflections on how my thinking's developed in the 2 years since I wrote that paper. As a good way into these topics, I'm going to use this short excerpt, which is taken from page 17 of Alice Hattrick's Ill Feelings. It reads, "My mother and I have symptoms of illness without any known cause, according to them the status of feelings confined to our bodies or our sense of them as ill. Ill, bad, sick, wrong is also how I learned to feel about my diagnosis. Those ill feelings were not really my own, but reflections of societal ones, which deemed people ME CFS as fakers, scroungers, lazy and privileged, and indeed all chronically ill and disabled people as less than human, deserving of fewer rights, less pay, and less security and care." The excerpt elucidates the dual meaning behind the text, rather cryptic title. Hattrick and their mother feel ill. They experience symptoms including orthostatic intolerance, cognitive impairment, and extreme fatigue, which follow a pattern of post-exertional symptom exacerbation that's characteristic of ME/CFS or myalgic encephalomyelitis chronic fatigue syndrome. But they've also learned to feel ill, bad, sick, wrong about these symptoms, and these ill feelings are internalized reflections of societal ones. Hattrick alludes here to a diagnostic hierarchy within Western biomedicine, in which symptoms which occur without any known cause are relegated to the status of feelings. In ill feelings, they record the affective consequences of this hierarchy with a sustained focus on shame, the excruciating self-conscious awareness that the self is fundamentally flawed, defective, or bad, sick, wrong. And it's this apparent affinity between these dual meanings of ill feelings, so between shame and these symptoms of illness without any known cause, that I'll focus on in this presentation. And I'll do this by analysing two first-person accounts of ME/CFS, the first, of course, being Ill Feelings. Ill Feelings is a long-form and book-length essay. It depicts Hattrick's own experiences of illness as well as their mother's. This is the blurb declares, and I've got a picture of the blurb on the screen here. A genre-bending debut which blends memoir, medical history, biography, and literary non-fiction to uncover both of their case histories, there being Hattrick and their mother. And the material employed in the service of this uncovering spans centuries and includes excerpts from the work of canonical women writers such as Virginia Woolf and Elizabeth Barrett Browning, alongside academic, clinical, and archival sources. In its bending and blending of genres, ill feelings could be described as a hybrid form of life writing. And this is a term that I've borrowed from Sarah Wasson, who makes this passing reference to a hybrid autobiography and academic study in her 2018 paper Before Narrative. I haven't been able to find any extended critical discussion of this genre, and if you do know any, please do let me know. But it's certainly clear that this form of life writing is growing in popularity, and I've included just a few examples on this slide. The other account of ill feelings that I'll discuss in this presentation was not written but spoken in an interview I did with a woman who we'll call Fiona. Fiona is a white British woman, and at the time of that interview, she was in her 40s, and she'd been unwell with ME/CFS for almost a decade. Our interview took place over Zoom so we could hear and see each other. It was in late 2021 and it lasted 90 minutes. It was one of 10 interviews that I completed for my PhD project. It followed a rough interview topic guide covering a variety of topics related to shame and stigma in relation to experiences of illness that occur, as Hattrick has it, without any known cause. And in this presentation, I'm going to draw on quotes from Fiona's interview transcript, and this was produced verbatim from an audio recording that was taken of our interview. So in my analysis of these two accounts, I'm going to ask two questions. So I want to know, firstly, what bringing into dialogue different forms of storytelling, specifically interview and memoir or interview and a long form essay, can tell us about the experience and expression of shame. And secondly, I'll ask whether these symptoms of illness without any known cause might provoke a kind of shame that's distinct from that's associated with other recognised illnesses. So I'm going to start with the latter before coming to reflect on the former, and I'll do this through the lens of diagnosis. At roughly the midway point of ill feelings, Hattrick asks, why are the treatments suggested to my mother and me all seemingly acceptable, everyday or even fashionable, when our diagnosis is anything but, when it is shameful or plain embarrassing, as if it is something we should just keep to ourselves? The italics here enact a typographical whisper, raising the topic of shame in perhaps appropriately hushed tones, but why are they necessary? Hattrick's long-form essay and Fiona's interview testimony illuminate how diagnostic labels like ME/CFS can distort and obscure the suffering that occurs beneath them. These diagnoses, I shall argue, do not make this suffering invisible, they don't simply hide it or make it disappear. Instead, these diagnostic labels appear to provoke a shame-inducing sense of invisibility. They force experiences into and under labels that are recognisable and indeed are recognised, but which do not permit any recognition of the suffering that's endured. When I asked Fiona what she thought of the label chronic fatigue syndrome, she replied, I think the fatigue label is problematic. Everyone's felt tired, you know. It's not that bad, is it? One of the problems with the label is that people think they know how you feel, and they don't. You know, I've been there and I've been here, and I can see the difference. If Fiona can see the difference between the fatigue that's experienced by the healthy and the experience of living with chronic fatigue syndrome or ME/CFS, but those around her can't. And this is problematic because Fiona is not offered an opportunity to bring to light the reality of her illness experience, because those around her already think that they know how she feels. They believe themselves to have an insight into her life, but this is a false image that's irreflective of her reality. So here, the literal centrality of fatigue within the label chronic fatigue syndrome is seen to hide both the variation and the severity of the symptoms that's experienced by those who live with the condition. And I think many would be surprised to learn that quality of life studies, which have been conducted across decades and continents, have repeatedly testified to the fact that those living with ME/CFS enjoy a lower quality of life and higher functional impairment than that which occurs in the context of other chronic illnesses, which include congestive heart failure, multiple sclerosis, and many types of cancer. In writing of ME/CFS, Hattrick comments, it is that kind of illness, somehow ubiquitous or at least recognisable, continually reported on and always inexplicable. And I think this excerpt speaks to an uncomfortable amalgam of excess and absence of visibility and invisibility, as the recognition that's sparked by these diagnostic labels is not mirrored by any recognition of the patterns of symptoms they purport to classify. In light of the above, Hattrick's definition of diagnosis is perhaps no surprise. Diagnosis is a naming exercise. It groups you together with others like you, turning your singular experience into one of many. But it is also a condemnation. Some have called ME/CFS the trash can of diagnoses. My mother's diagnosis was not rubbish because of the prognosis or wide-ranging symptoms, including for the most severely affected, which is indeed awful in and of itself. but because the name conferred something else, that you couldn't be helped, that there was nothing to be done for you except what you could do for yourself. You had to adjust your own erroneous symptom beliefs, stop speaking that hysterical language, build up your exercise tolerance, even if your body screams no. And I just want to insert a brief interlude here to comment that when Hattrick writes that the name conferred something else and lists what it is that this name conferred, and I've put this section in bold on the left, they're referring directly to the clinical literature, which has presented MECFS as, for example, and on the right here, there's some quotes from relevant parts of the clinical literature. So MECFS has been presented as, and I quote, a real but reversible condition that the patient may influence by practical self-help, and that it's perpetuated by the patient's illness beliefs. So Hattrick's reflections on diagnosis continue thus. It was not that I did not want to be disabled. There was no shame in that. The shame arose in encounters with able people, specifically when the idea of me and my inherent bodily knowledge of my own needs and limitations did not align with their intellectual assumptions. So for Hattrick, shame does not arise from the disabling symptoms. It's not something that's intrinsic to their experience of illness, but rather it's something that's constructed and that arises when there's this misalignment between their own inherent bodily knowledge and others' intellectual assumptions. And I think that Hattrick's choice of the term intellectual here seems perhaps to highlight the root of these assumptions within the academic or clinical literature. Fiona also alluded to this particular narrativization of MECFS. The idea is quite broad, she told me. It seems quite well accepted, really, that I should have the capacity to get better. I should be able to get better. And the reason that I haven't got better is because I've not done the right thing. She was frequently made to feel as though she was to blame for her ongoing symptoms, as she later made explicit. And she said, I've lived really well, you know, I eat more than my 5 a day, and I always have done. I've exercised, I've done the right things, and yet I am literally treated as if I've caused my own illness and I'm responsible for it being ongoing. Understandably, Fiona clearly found these experiences distressing, although more so due to the comparison that she'd been able to draw between the treatment that she'd received for her MECFS and the treatment that a relative was receiving for cancer at the same time. So in referring to this relative, Fiona said, nobody suggested that it was their faulty thinking that gave them cancer, and yet it was probably as much or as little as my illness, because we're all affected by our psychology. But they were never made to feel that their cancer was their fault, and never made to feel that it was their responsibility to get better. I find that discrepancy very challenging, really. And I feel this last sentence, the sort of reference to it being very challenging, is reminiscent of the often, I think, euphemistic nature of the semi-stretched interview, where pain that's heard so clearly in tone of voice and so visible in body language is understated in the transcript. So if diagnosis is also a condemnation, those who live with MECFS certainly appear to be condemned to endure both a heightened visibility as a spotlight is shone on their perceived failures to reverse this supposedly real but reversible condition, and also a crushing invisibility, as their suffering is not just unseen, but is actively hidden by the labels and narratives that distort and obscure it. The synonyms for ill are, as Hattrick reminds us, bad, sick, wrong, and for those who live with ill feelings, the badness, sickness, and wrongness are located not within their bodies, but within themselves. I think the shame that this provokes is corrosive and potentially destructive. Hattrick writes of their mother, she was suicidal and alone. A relationship had broken down. She told me she wanted to die. For the first time, I felt that as a reality. She might die on purpose. How could I tell her what I did not know then? That she felt that there was something wrong with her, and I felt the same. I didn't then inhabit the knowledge of illness I have now. Illness had been something my mother and I had already been possessed by for a long time. We saw ourselves as defective, unlovable. So Hattrick writes that their mother felt that there was something wrong with her. I think they're playing with the phrase that's usually employed to express the feeling that there's something wrong in our bodies. But here the meaning's reversed. So Hattrick's mother felt that there was something wrong with her, but this is an inherent wrongness, some sort of core badness within herself. And Hattrick felt the same. We saw ourselves as defective, unlovable, they write, and this concludes this paragraph. Hattrick doesn't mention shame explicitly in this paragraph, although the sentences that follow immediately afterwards do make an explicit mention of shame. But I feel that shame is palpable here, as Hattrick and their mother seem to focus their attention self-consciously inwards on what's wrong inside themselves. The shame is subtle and perhaps even imperceptible, especially at the time, but its destructive potential is clear. She was suicidal and alone. I think the same appears to ring true for Fiona. Referring to ME/CFS, she said, "I think it's a very, very negatively viewed illness," and she then elaborated on the impact. The effect is damaging people. I find it very hard to live with. I've got extremely low self-esteem, and I've always been quite robust in that regard. I've always thought pretty well of myself. I've always been proud of myself, and there's a bit of me that thinks I probably should feel proud now of enduring and achieving what I have achieved, but I don't." So Fiona at this point was overwhelmed by emotion, and she spoke the next words through tears. And she said, I do feel ashamed to be myself, and that's a really hard thing." And again, we have the sort of euphemistic nature of how it seems written down in the transcript. So Fiona's self-esteem and the pride that she previously took in herself has been eroded, I think, by the negative perceptions of her illness, which have, over time, this has been almost a decade that she'd been ill, caused her to view herself as she believes she's seen by others, with devastating consequences. I think it would seem that in these contexts, to feel shame is not, as Gershon Kaufman has it, to feel seen in a painfully diminished sense, but rather to feel seen in a painfully distorted sense. For Fiona and Hattrick, shame does not reveal the inner self, exposing it to view. Instead, they're seen through particular lenses and labels that obscure their reality. What is exposed is not the inner self, but the images that have been superimposed or overlaid upon it, and which plunge their lived experiences further into darkness. A sense of simultaneous invisibility, of feeling both seen and unseen, is at the heart, I feel, of these shame experiences, but also of Fiona's and Hattrick's responses to them. From the depths of their shame, unable to feel proud of themselves, seeing themselves as defective and unlovable, they seek not, or perhaps not only, to hide, but also to make themselves visible. For example, in our interview, Fiona discussed hiding her diagnosis of ME/CFS from those around her. She said, "I don't actually tell people what's wrong with me usually. I just fudge over that. And I will say, I've got poor health or some health difficulties. I feel that if I say that to people, they will view me with a set of prejudices, and I want people to see me and not a set of prejudices." I think when Fiona began these sentences, I thought that I would hear an expression of the desire to hide and cover oneself and become invisible, and for the ground to sort of swallow you up, that's so typically associated with shame. And indeed, Fiona's repetition of that, which she employs on occasion instead of "my diagnosis" or ME/CFS, certainly gives this impression. She couldn't even sort of utter the words in this context. But I think what emerged ultimately was a desire for visibility. Fiona really wants to be seen. She hides the name of her illness so that she might be seen, so she might have more visibility, not through this label or through a set of prejudices that are associated with it, but as herself. And Fiona returned to the topic later in the interview, when she told me that she now avoided meeting new people, which is something that she'd previously enjoyed. "I feel really afraid," she told me, "of how I'm going to be perceived. I really worry that new people will not see, they'll just see the problems and not see who I am." And I think Fiona's sadness sings out in this moving expression of loss, and her fear too was palpable, but I think it's notable that she wasn't afraid of being seen. She was afraid of not being seen for who she is. And for Fiona, it would appear that it's not the experience of shame that reveals the inner self and exposes it to view, but rather the response to shame that seeks to reveal the inner self and to expose it to unobstructed view. So if it is that the shame that those living with what Hattrick terms ill feelings is characterised by feeling simultaneously seen and unseen, and that the response to this shame is to seek not invisibility, but rather a type of sort of controlled exposure, I want to conclude by considering whether ill feelings as this hybrid form of life writing might create a unique space for this response to shame, or indeed whether it might transform shame or do something with or to it. And in order to do this, I'm going to continue to look through the lens of diagnosis, and this will require just a brief gloss of some other background information. So to borrow Hattrick's phrasing, the name myalgic encephalomyelitis, or ME, once conferred something else. In 1956, the anonymous author of a paper in The Lancet, there's a picture of this here, proposed benign myalgic encephalomyelitis as a potentially acceptable term for a new clinical entity. This was a viral illness that resembled poliomyelitis, and it had occurred in a series of outbreaks across Europe and the USA in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. What was notable about this new clinical entity was that it frequently provoked a well-defined state of chronic ill health in a proportion that varied from outbreak to outbreak. And it was over the next 3 decades until the 80s that research focused on the biological mechanisms of this disease. In the late 1980s, however, the approach changed. So a so-called new approach was proposed, which posited the illness, while triggered by an acute viral infection, was perpetuated by a pattern of maladaptive beliefs and fear of women's behaviours. This new approach transformed the illness from a poorly understood disease to, as I said previously, a real but reversible condition. This was a very deliberate transformation, as you can see here from a paper in 1989. And it's this transformation that Hattrick records in Ill Feelings. So in a section entitled Unknown Etiology, they provide a detailed and historically accurate account of a number of outbreaks of this obscure illness, the obscure illness that would be called benign myalgic encephalomyelitis, or a new clinical entity. And this section is clearly the product of extensive research that Hattrick cites from numerous sources, from medical journals to diaries, to bring to life these original outbreaks of what would be termed benign myalgic encephalomyelitis. And the paratextual material includes 30 pages of sources, which are situated at the back of the text. So the reading experience, particularly of sections like this one, is akin to an academic monograph. So the reader's focus is intermittently interrupted by flicking back and forth from text to sources and back again. And it feels like a sort of very material and very regular reminder that this book-length object, which could automatically, perhaps even instinctively, been classified as a straightforward memoir, is a recording of the objective as well as the subjective. I think perhaps the best example of what Hattrick's trying to do with and through this hybrid form of life writing, specifically in the context of diagnosis, is found within this section. So the section discussed previously, and it's on page 41. And here we find this short one-sentence paragraph, which bisects what seems to be a continuation of this extended historical overview of this so-called obscure illness. And it reads, "To obscure is not to express yourself clearly, but it is also to keep from being seen, to conceal." I think the reader's eye is really drawn to this paragraph, which is why I've included this picture of the text. I'm not sure quite how well that came out. But the sentence interrupts the flow of text both topically and typographically by means of its unusually short length and its italicized font. But Hattrick's meaning is of self-obscured. The author's use of obscure as a verb, not as in their previous reference to this obscure illness as an adjective, suggests some sort of direct and deliberate action. It's a process of obscuring. So if we look again at the paragraphs between which this sentence is sandwiched, while these may initially appear to form part of a detached academic overview of the history of these outbreaks, I want to point out something that may only appear to those like Hattrick who are really familiar with this literature on NECFS. So when Hattrick refers here to the disproportionate depression and emotional lability, and then at the other side of this sentence, to the supposed hysterical features that were noted in a report made during one of these outbreaks, they are referring to material which was directly cited by the authors of the paper in the BMJ, which was published in 1970. And this paper has arguably been critical in this reconsideration, or this reframing or re-narrativization of what was originally deemed an organic disease and eventually became a real but reversible condition. So in this paper, the authors, McEvedy and Beard, tell a different story about one particular outbreak of this obscure illness, which was at the Royal Free Hospital in 1955, by reclassifying it as epidemic hysteria, and they draw on data in the abstract here, which is the high attack rate in females compared to males. And you can see here, for example, and this last picture quote is on page 9 of this BMJ paper. It's the exact quotation that Hattrick draws from the 1956 staff report, and it's the same one that's used here. But Hattrick does cite this BMJ paper later in their list of sources, so they're clearly aware of it, but they don't list it in the sources relied upon for this particular page, so this is just my supposition. But I think that when read in this light, this cryptic sentence could perhaps be seen as Hattrick interjecting their authorial voice into this historical overview in order to make visible the processes through which this once obscure illness was itself obscured. And I think it's particularly pertinent and perhaps even poignant that Hattrick's choosing to do this, or is able to do this perhaps by mirroring the form of an academic text and taking on its associated prestige and power. For it was, as previously discussed, within academic text that ME/CFS was transformed from organic disease to epidemic hysteria to a real irreversible condition. So in order to think through what Hattrick's doing to shame and with shame in ill feelings, and by way of finishing this presentation, I want to briefly consider how scholarship has treated literary or written expressions of shame. In her 2019 monograph, Writing Shame, Gender, Contemporary Literature and Negative Effect, Kay Mitchell notes that existing analyses of literary treatments of shame have precisely tended to privilege stories of overcoming and or to see the writing of shame as necessarily and positively transformative. Implicitly, they figure the writing of shame as testimony or as catharsis. And I think that an apt example of these kinds of literary treatments of shame is in Jade Brooks Bowson's Embodied Shame, when she writes that the way out of the shame impasse is the recognition of shame and the narration of the shame story. So the catharsis that Bowson alludes to here is almost reminiscent of confession as it functions in Christianity. So where sins are formed into short stories and recounted privately or to a priest, so that absolution or spiritual healing can occur. I don't think that this is what Hattrick is doing in Ill Feelings. But while they do narrate their own shame story, they don't appear to do so with any intention of resolving or overcoming or writing themselves out of shame, sort of purging themselves of it in writing. Instead, I believe that Hattrick depicts another kind of shame story in Ill Feelings, a shaming narrative which has obscured and distorted suffering and has rendered the diagnosis of ME/CFS something they should keep to themselves, something shameful. As I touched upon earlier in this presentation, shame for Hattrick appears to not be incidental nor inherent to their experience of illness. It's something that they've learned to feel, something that arose in encounters with able people as a result of other people's intellectual assumptions. And in Ill Feelings, they make visible the processes and stories through which this shame was constructed, how it was learned, how it arose. I think Fiona obviously so desperately wanted to be seen for who she is and not through a set of prejudices. And I think it's this, perhaps, that the hybrid memoir permits. Hattrick is able, through their prose, which resembles both memoir and academic text, to transform how their readers see them and others who live with ME/CFS. And so I'll finish with a final question, which is to ask whether it might be that by making visible these shaming narratives, these stories that made them feel bad, sick, wrong about their diagnosis, stories that meant that their diagnosis conferred something else, is it by doing this that Hattrick attempts to pull all those with ME/CFS away from distortion and obscurity, or perhaps even to guide them out of the shame impulse? Thank you. Looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Katharine. I think what we'll do is we'll take questions from the room and then from online, and we'll just do a sort of tennis ball of questions. Not to prefer presence to absent presence, but I will start with the room, and then if you want to also ask your question, please put up your hand or put a question in the chat. I can read it out for you. Thank you. Are there any questions? Yeah. Is that a question for you?
Yeah, I really enjoyed that. Thank you. I find it really convincing to kind of the bit you end on it, where you're kind of like framing it as not so much a dissipation of personal shame, but as like a kind of more I guess kind of like epistemic contestation of these meta-narratives that are going on. And I find that really useful. I think you kind of set out really early what what the kind of shaming scripts are around this. But what I wonder whether can you say more about not exactly the historical context, but there are sorry, I'm struggling to put this well. There are obviously conditions that make those scripts shaming and in which those scripts take place as scripts of shame.
Yeah.
And I wondered whether you could, or whether there's more to be said about like what kind of broader sort of social, cultural, ideological investment there is, like e.g. in like productivity, that then makes those things as shaming as they are in that particular place and time. Is that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think one of the things that, so this sort of particularly the end of the presentation that was about sort of shaming narratives and how, so I guess specifically, although implicitly asking the question of how academic research can in some cases be shaming and how that can be created in health research, and how that's perhaps the way that shame in medicine functions. I think these are questions that I'm wanting to ask in another project. So I guess my answer is partly that I think that I'd need to do more research into that. But one of the things I'm really interested in is how these narratives that emerge around MECFS in the 80s emerged in the context of, I guess, a broader sort of neoliberal agenda. And I wonder how that sort of works also with this broader concept is in the exact same time frame as the sort of talking about medically unexplained symptoms and how those narratives around just more broadly these illnesses without any known cause, how that, I guess, comes into play. And I think also specifically MECFS, one of the things that I'd like to look at is how the AIDS crisis fed into that and how this sort of, was there a wish to distance? I mean, it's in the, you know, it's in the 80s, there's sort of it's perhaps going into too much detail, but this reference to sort of mysterious viruses. I think it's because it's specifically the viral element of this that's sort of rewritten, I guess. Sort of that was so key to these earlier research articles, and then disappeared, and the focus was on fatigue, and the focus was on beliefs and behaviours and the patient's own self-management and reversing their own condition. That really wasn't a very good answer, but I think it's a really key and important thing. And yeah, I'd like to know more about it.
Yeah, no, thank you.
So Kay's got a question. I thought though we might cover Martin's point first, and then Kay, if you want to ask a question either in the chat or you can unmute. Martin said to entirely miss the point of the talk and go straight to the history. I was wondering whether you'd encountered Kate McAllister's work on encephalitis lethargica and the British health system in the 20th century. In case not, it might be useful for exploring Fred's question around the historical nature of shame in relation to fatigue. I don't know if you've want to comment on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, Kate's work is brilliant, and I've read, I think, one of her papers. I don't think I've been able to read her thesis, although I should track that down. Yeah, I think that's, I think all of this perhaps has come to light in the pandemic with this sort of bringing to light the narratives that are currently being told, for example, around long COVID and how that feeds into, I think, my work, but also definitely Kate's work. And so that's, yeah, definitely something to point out. Thank you, Martin.
Okay.
Hi, apologies first of all because I'm not very well, so I don't know how appropriate that is for the session. So hence I might stop coughing at some point and have to mute myself. Thank you, Katharine. That was really interesting. And as you know, because we've been in touch already, I've been writing about ill feelings as well, and I think it's such a fascinating text. So I have various kinds of questions and thoughts, and apologies if they, many of them will seem very obvious to you, I'm sure. I mean, in my own writing about it, I was thinking quite a lot about questions of gender and queerness, which are obviously central to this book. And it seems to me that what emerges is an interesting, a sort of parallel, not just a sort of shaming for the symptoms of MECFS, but also a kind of pathologization of Alice's queerness and her mother's queerness and of their relationship, which is seen as being sort of too intense and too unhealthy. And so femininity and queerness are themselves presented as kind of infectious somehow. And that seems to me a really sort of interesting element of that. And also something that plays out in other narratives about illness, like Johanna Hedver's sick woman theory, which again, I'm sure you're familiar with. So I was just supposed just to ask whether you had any thoughts on that, and or maybe just add a couple of other things that I thought about, and please feel free to respond to any or none of this. One, I suppose this question of inherent bodily knowledge that this text brings up, which seems so crucial to medical sort of self-reporting. And I wondered what the impact might be for how we think more generally about the state of our bodies and illness. And because in some ways I want to sort of believe what people tell me about how they're feeling, but also I'm aware that it's more complex than that. And I wonder whether something like ME/CFS is asking quite profound questions of medicine as we currently practice it and understand it, and about what counts as knowledge and who possesses that knowledge, who has expertise, I suppose. And I mean, again, I'm often seeing this through the lens of feminism and queer theory, because that's the way I work. And I've done such a lot of work on the sort of pathologization of homosexuality in the 1950s, which is so often attended by narratives suggesting that, you know, the lesbian does not know herself, doesn't understand herself, that other outside experts can better judge who she is and what she's like. So I think that question of inherent bodily knowledge, what counts as knowledge and whose testimony we should or shouldn't trust, those are really interesting questions for me. In my own work on this text, I was thinking about Lee Gilmore's work on women's autobiography and on women as kind of tainted witnesses, as always perceived as unreliable somehow. And finally, and then I'll be quiet, I'm really glad that you're drawing attention to the hybrid form here. I mean, again, I tend to think about this in relation to shame and the way in which the form might be responding to the question of shame, because of a kind of shaming that often attends women's autobiographical writing, which is seen as sort of oversharing, narcissistic, self-indulgent. So I wonder whether these hybrid forms, which bring in essay, which bring in other people's stories, actually try to mitigate those shaming accusations of narcissism. So it's in that sense, it's almost like a displacement of the self from center stage, that you say, well, look at all this work I've done, you know, and clearly Hattrick has done, you know, that sort of historical work, that research. So it does read so much like essay in so many ways. So I feel like that's more thoughts than questions. Sorry, but I would love to chat to you about this at more length at some point, because I think there's so many points of contact here in what we're doing. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kayla. Yeah, I'd really love to talk to you more about this. But I think that that's such an important sort of few comments, and particularly, I mean, I think gender was such a, so my PhD was obviously on women's experiences, broadly defined, but I think gender was almost sort of everywhere and nowhere in my thesis. So I definitely would turn to your work on writing shame as this, as sort of being able to get more in depth and to say something really interesting about this. Sort of, I think you say the kind of like a triangulation of shame, writing and gender or something. I really like that phrasing. But I just want to say a few things. I've just been making a few notes. I think the idea of this inherent bodily knowledge is a really, really good one, specifically to consider in the light of ME/CFS, and the idea of what counts as knowledge and what counts as evidence. I wonder that, I think it's so ironic, and I was thinking this as I was writing this presentation, that this is, I guess, a condition where those who live with it have been believed, and quite cruelly and quite sort of, the sort of, I don't know if you remember the kind of vilification of people with ME in the UK media and the 90s and noughties as this sort of this caricature of people with ME who send death threats and who are vicious and dangerous, and specifically towards academics. But it's so ironic, I think, that the literature is so much based on belief. There's no this whole idea that it is an illness caused by maladaptive beliefs and fear avoidance behaviour is so frequently followed by no citations. There's just, it's sort of an adapted, and originally it is a story. It's I don't want to get too in depth because it's perhaps going off on a tangent, but it's initially proposed as a hypothesis, as an approach. And the evidence that was eventually, and this was right into the noughties when there was a sort of definitive trial that was conducted, has recently been appraised by a NICE guidance panel as sort of low or very low quality. So it's the sort of how beliefs are mobilized against different groups in this context is, I think, specifically interesting. And I think the inherent bodily knowledge linking into the hybrid form. And I think I've also been wondering, with the quote about the obscure illness that I pulled out, I was wondering how and why Hattrick has chosen to make that so implicit, why they hadn't just said the sort of this more kind of argument about it, because it seems so obvious from what they're putting together from a knowledge of the literature, and how that, I guess, relates to the status as an unreliable witness, as someone who has an ME/CFS diagnosis, and whether that came into it, and whether gender came into it as well, but which my comments haven't been as put together. But yeah, sorry, I'll finish there, but that's really interesting. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And I also just wanted to mention, I know that Chloe Green has a book, I think, coming out with Edinburgh University Press, which deals with illness narratives. And I may also be able to get hold of a copy of that for you. And there was a PhD I examined at Birkbeck, God, a year or two ago, by Lisa Gronwald, who touches on Hattrick, at least briefly, in talking about illness narratives and kind of productivity. So some of those questions around, I suppose, around kind of capitalism and which I would also sort of extend, I suppose, to think about that sort of neoliberal idea of self-fashioning, which makes us sort of responsible, seemingly, for our own welfare rather than relying upon societal structures and institutions, as we perhaps should be able to. And that's maybe something that is happening within medicine more generally, I think, with this idea of, yes, treating yourself, using online resources, or going to your pharmacy and buying self-testing kits rather than bothering your GP. So,
Yeah.
So there's perhaps that sort of wider phenomenon going on there. I wondered whether you knew more as well about, which I don't, I suppose, about a sort of shifting understanding of the psychosomatic, because certainly some of that quite pathologizing work on ME/CFS that happens in, I guess, the sort of 80s and 90s, as you were talking about, like Shorter's book From Paralysis to Fatigue, which is just kind of excoriating, really, the way that it treats sufferers of ME/CFS. But I wondered whether actually we're coming to a better understanding of the psychosomatic, which doesn't see that as describing something as psychosomatic as necessarily derogatory, I guess.
Yeah, I think that speaks to a really interesting sort of element of these narratives that have been created in the academic literature around ME/CFS, which is that there's often this sort of weaponized, this dualistic, and it's explicitly referred to as a dualistic, sort of any critique of ME/CFS and the accounts of it, for example, as a real but reversible condition, as something that's maintained by beliefs and behaviors, is often dismissed. I mean, this is a crude paraphrase, but as dualistic, as sort of people with ME stigmatize mental health conditions because they can't accept the stigma of a mental health diagnosis. There's sort of this weaponization, literal weaponization of stigma in these narratives. And I think it's this, because often, as you say, a lot of these narratives aren't actually psychogenic. They're not talking about trauma. I mean, Showalter and Edward Shorter definitely do this in the 90s, this sort of insertion of these kind of humanities, it's like deep humanities scholarship. But a lot of the clinical narratives, I think, they're not talking about this in many ways as an illness, whether it's a mental illness, a psychogenic illness, a biological illness. It's just, it's real but reversible. It isn't, it's something that you can, it's almost as if it's a lifestyle choice. And I think it's often I think these ideas are often kind of weaponized as, oh, but you're just criticizing it because you don't like the idea that this is a mental illness, whereas actually it's not saying, these arguments aren't saying that it's an illness at all. And I think that I guess is perhaps a good way to get rid of that critique. I haven't explained that very well, I'm sorry.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
Very, very quickly. I don't know. I'm not disagreeing with that last point about better understandings of how psychosomatic processes work. But to me there's something quite interesting, and there's like I think one of the things that does happen in the last however many 60, 70 years is there is like whether our understandings of psychosomatic things get better or not, there's a devaluation of them at the same time. So I mean, if you look at like 1950s work on psychosomatic problems, some of it is kind of dismissive, unpleasant, not great, and some of it is like, oh yeah, these are psychosomatic problems, and that's fine, and that's just as valid as if they have like a kind of like a really obvious physical genesis. So one of the things that happens is not necessarily about the depth of knowledge, but about what we then judge to be like a good reason to be sick. I don't know. That's just a thought.
Yeah, it's a good. Sorry, I don't want to monopolize.
I was going to take one question from Kat, but I did want to raise this question, this comment raised by Hannah. The thought that emerged is that CFS framed as an individual psychogenic illness, the obscure illness is probably referred to as a mass psychogenic illness. Now, previously mass hysteria, the latter's seemingly been de-shamed to an extent due to the Cuban embassy incident. Prior to that, it tended to be associated with non-Western countries, women. Not a question, more of a comment, so hence not putting my hand up.
Sounds like some interesting history there. I'm not familiar with that.
Kat, do you want to?
Yeah, I think my question maybe kind of ties into that a little bit. First of all, thank you for the talk. That was really great. I was wondering about, so you mentioned that there was sort of a reframing of MECFS that was taking place. And I didn't have a chance to read through the whole kind of reframed version, but I was sort of like, oh God, because that is like the opposite of what people who I know who have MECFS, or what I learn from the literature, like saying, this is what it's like, right? They're very much like trying to make people understand that, like, if they go out there and do stuff, even though they don't have the energy, shit's gonna get worse, right?
Yeah.
And like very much trying to push back against that idea that you can like exercise it away, for
Yes,
example,
totally,
right? And so I was wondering, if, since you kind of pointed out that it seems like that was an understanding people initially seemed to have, that like you should avoid activity.
Yeah.
And then that was reframed again.
Yes.
And so that's really interesting to me, of like the way in which maybe there is like different kinds or additional or more, or I'm not sure if I want to put it quantitatively in this way, shame attached to it now compared to when this sort of was originally a concept people were working with. And I think that ties into what Fred was saying of like, maybe there were times where there was maybe less shame attached to what we would now call an MECFS diagnosis compared to the way in which it has been reframed.
Yeah, I think that I mean, I guess it's hard to tell in terms of shame without this sort of like qualitative data on people's experiences. But I know one person who was diagnosed with ME prior to around the mid-80s of this sort of like transformation of the diagnosis, and they sort of were able to have, I think, some sort of had a muscle biopsy. That was what the research was on, about metabolic dysfunction and muscle fibers, and that they sort of speak to this transformation about how it was suddenly, you're treated by an immunologist and then you're suddenly sort of funneled out and given like energy charts to fill in to like pace yourself, and that's all about your own management, whereas previously you'd had this sort of medical involvement. So yeah, I think that is a really apt argument.
Yeah. I think especially because the some of the bits you picked up on from the interview and from ill feelings were really focusing on like, the shame is partly because people sort of think, oh, you should go deal with this yourself, right? Like you need to take responsibility of this yourself.
Yeah.
Which it like really comes out in that reframing.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I spoke yesterday to a clinician who was involved in a sort of professional body who it was sort of there was as if there was no concept that illness that doesn't have an explanation could exist and could endure without it being, and I quote, a failure to self-manage. Is this like there's no conceptualization that illness might persist for any other reason other than the person's not doing, as Fiona said, the right things. And yeah.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, but you do have an online.
Oh, do we have a Veronica?
To stick
Great.
to your.
Yeah, that's my own rules. Yeah. Veronica, do you have?
Hello, I hope, has this worked? Can you hear me?
Yes, we
Oh my
can.
gosh, a miracle. I had to take headphones out, turn volume up. It's lovely to see you all in Exeter. What a very delightful blast from the past. And Katharine, thank you so much for a really characteristically brilliant and interesting talk. Thank you very much. I was having a thought, and I think it tied into something about Hannah's comment as well. Something just came up to me through a couple of the things you said about the role of this idea of contagion and its relation to shame. And I think one of the things that is like fairly well addressed in the shame literature is shame as very contagious, which seems bang on to me. But I wondered, sort of looking the other way, this is interesting to me because one of the things I'm interested in is the way self-harm is framed as a contagion, specifically a social contagion, actually on, I think, quite shaky empirical grounds. And it has made me very aware of the way in which that label, social contagion, is applied to other things. And I think it seems interesting to me that this sort of mass psychogenic illness, we would now call that, I think, a social contagion. I think that that's not that those two things are the same, not least because what are either of those things, but I think that those labels are doing similar work. And I wondered if you saw something in your work, or if you thought there was something in this way that it's not just that being part of a social contagion is deeply shameful. And so when people apply the label social contagion, they're often framing themselves as doing like insightful social criticism, but what they're doing in practice is shaming the people they're describing. They're saying like, look, you got tricked. Look, this isn't real. Look, it's all in your head. And you're being kind of silly, aren't you? You're easily swayed. You're some girl on the internet and you should stop. I mean, that's not a very generous reading of their comments, but I don't feel generous. But I wonder if, in addition to that, which is perhaps a fairly self-evident point, there might be something interesting about the way in which social contagion as a label is applied to an experience that is already assumed to be shameful, but which persists. In that, in some way, it's being used to explain something that the sort of rational commentator thinks that the people shouldn't be admitting to. Like, you shouldn't admit that you self-harm, and you shouldn't admit that you're trans, and you shouldn't admit that you're tired all the time. And if you are admitting that and you think that those things like are legitimate and are significant, then you must have somehow been tricked. You must have caught this idea from somewhere, because why else would you admit to this thing that is very shameful? I've come up with this like in this 30 seconds, so it could be nonsense, but it really felt like something, an interesting connection between these different spheres, where the idea of contagiousness and shame and in some way like a real criticism of the people having these experiences seemed like significant connections.
Yeah, definitely. I think that, I don't know if you've read Elaine Showalter's histories. It's a really sort of good, or rather, I mean, perhaps not so good sort of exploration. And she discusses chronic fatigue syndrome alongside sort of alien abduction and all sorts of other things. And yeah, it's totally the argument. She makes the argument that you've said. Only this was before it sort of was believed that the social contagion, you know, takes place on like Twitter or whatever, the more relevant TikTok, I guess, that people are using. But it was sort of this social contagion was being spread by email, and this sort of like yeah. And I mean, it's just, she has the quote that the acronym ME is reveals only the patient's self-absorption, which I mean it's just quite cruel. And yeah, I mean, I still get people nowadays who live with ME tell me that they, you know, are really skeptical of the work that I'm doing because of its association with literary studies because of Elaine Showalter. So I mean, it's continued to have this really contagious obfuscation, perhaps not the wrong word, you know, sort of influence on people as you know, just as kind of rejected as the clinicians and just as influential in their mind. But thanks, Veronica. Sorry, I didn't give a very good answer.
Rebecca, did you want to?
Yeah, and yeah, thank you very much. And this, in a sense, also picks up a little bit on what Kay was talking about, because I was interested in the kind of thinking about the literary project, that this hybrid literary project. And on the one hand, I can see very nicely the way that it combining subjective and objective is kind of homologous in some way to the disease, ME, and all sorts of things going on there. But I was also thinking about, how does it matter to the project how it's received or whatever? So is the writing in some sense about individual de-shaming, and it doesn't matter, you just write it and use the process, or does it then matter whether people think it's narcissistic and just shows, or that it is somehow persuasive in some way? Or I guess one of the other things I was thinking about is that some of the similar projects tend to be very communitarian in a way, that lots of people have to kind of, that the sense is that people do it together in a way, and that it builds a community, or it builds, which is sort of different. But I just wondered whether there was any sense of those sorts of,
Yeah, I've wondered this because when I was rereading Ill Feelings for this presentation, I was wondering sort of how this is received, and sort of also who's read it. It's really interesting to me that people have perhaps read it, and I've seen on, you know, online that people who have engaged with it without a sort of formal knowledge of MECFS, which is really fascinating to me. And I don't know how that text would be, but how much of that would be understood, I guess, because a lot of it is quite cryptic, and how much would be taken in, I wonder. I don't know, I really don't know, but I've almost wondered as to whether it's almost giving, if it is read, for example, by people who live with MECFS or other conditions that are considered to be medically unexplained, whether that is a way of writing an alternate history and a sort of something, feeling part of a community. I guess it seems to be very much what Hattrick's doing, in that it's sort of this picking up of canonical women writers and less well-known women writers who have been ill, and sort of like Alice James with this, you know, ill feelings, and yeah, it's this creation of a kind of, I guess, sense of community, but a broader sort of historical sense that, you know, you're not alone. I guess it's this. There's people who have experienced this before you. Perhaps it would say to a reader, I don't know, but it's a really good point.
We are at time. I know that we said originally it was advertised as 1 to 2:30. But we thought we would leave people wanting more. And also, everybody loves, as Laura Salisbury, everybody loves the gift of time. So if there aren't any, I'll point out that Hannah's sort of makes this remark: with masked social contagion, having lived through one spiking with needles, not in drinks, I found it an interesting experience, in my view, manifestation of collective anxiety lying elsewhere. If there aren't any last minute burning questions, I call it a close and say thank you again very much, Katharine, for a wonderful talk. And as you can see from the engagement, a really important topic.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
And a great launch.
Watching myself on the screen, more and more like red.